What was the biggest reason behind the Falcons' slow start on offense against the Broncos? Well, it all starts up front.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by PrizePicks. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code in all lowercase LockedOnNFL to win $50 instantly when you play $5. So if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. Mr. AKA. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for a very long time, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I think each and every one of you that goes strong with me each and every day as everydayers means that you watch or listen to this podcast each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode is a All-22 review where we'll be breaking down what I saw on film between the Falcons and Broncos. Not a lot of good, but we'll focus on my biggest pet peeve on Jimmy Lake's scheme and why the Falcons' lack of pass rush is exacerbating that. We'll look ahead a little bit to the offseason to how the Falcons can address some of these issues on the defense to improve that unit. But we're going to start with the offense, hammering home the point that I think this team's success moving forward is really about the offense playing much better football than they played on Sunday against the Broncos. And basically the defense can just tread water and be mediocre. And the Falcons can't afford for the offense to tread water and be mediocre. They have to be great. And they were not on Sunday. They were mediocre on Sunday. And so the question is why? Why did they get off to such a slow start in this game? And, I mentioned on yesterday's episode, my initial glance at the film that I thought the wide receivers weren't winning enough. And after fully watching the film, I think the wide receivers are fine. I'll back off that opinion a little bit. My main issue now has become watching the full film is I think the Falcons started slow mostly due to the offensive line play. That the offensive line did not play terribly in this game, but I do think some of the early game struggles, the majority of the early game struggles with the offense, when this offense wasn't clicking early in the game, especially in the second quarter, were due to the offensive line not executing, right? Now, we saw on that opening drive for the Falcons offense looked good, right? They were able to move the ball well, and then they got into the red zone, and what killed them on that drive was penalties, right? But then when you look at the subsequent drives in the second quarter, to me, the breakdowns that cost them the most were really on the upfront, right? You had a bad snap from Ryan Nuzul that led to a loss of down. You had a sack and a pressure given up by Matthew Bergeron. You had the run game that was mostly ineffective after that opening series in this game because the offensive line couldn't create holes. You had that 4th and 1 play in the second quarter where Drake London caught the big game where Kirk Cousins had like an hour to throw the football, and you say, Aaron, how can you be critical of the offensive line? They gave, Kirk 6 seconds to get rid of that ball. And, my initial thoughts of why I thought the wide receivers were a little bit more questionable was because it's like it took, Drake London and the rest of the receiver corps a full 6 seconds to create that separation. So that was kind of my initial takeaway, just sort of at that quick glance watching the film. But now that I look at that play and look at the rest of the game, that play where the offensive line held up really well and the receivers were more of a letdown on that particular play, that was more the exception, not the necessarily rule in the rest of the game. And you look at that play in particular where it was 4th and 1, Denver didn't have their pass rushing front in that particular down, right? No Lanterns, no Kryptonians, no Jonathan Cooper, no Nick Benito, no John Franklin Myers on that particular down. They had their run stopping D-line in, because the expectation that Falcons could run the ball in 4th and 1. And that's, to me, what led to the offensive line being able to hold up for as long as they did, because they, other than Zach Allen, if you got him blocked on that play, he was the only guy that was going to threaten you on that play. And when we talk about the Falcons offensive line struggles, like the interior to me deserves to be called out a little bit more. I thought Chris Lindstrom had one of his weaker games of the year against this Broncos front. Ryan Nuzul had several bad snaps, at least 4, if not 5 in this game. Broncos nose tackle DJ Jones gave him a lot of trouble in this game. Matthew Bergeron, to me, was a typical Matthew Bergeron game, which is a not particularly good game. He continues to, in my opinion, be mostly a non-factor in the run game. which is part of the reason why I'm so down on him, because that was a strength of his at Syracuse in college. And that is not something that should take, 3 years to develop in the NFL. That should be something that immediately translates to the NFL. He's been better this year in pass protection than he was last year, but this game he struggled, particularly against Zach Allen. And again, that's fair. Zach Allen leads the NFL among all D tackles in terms of pressures this year, should be a Pro Bowl player. So it's not, it's not like crazy that Matthew Bergeron, had a rough go of things in this game. You look at the tackle play, Caleb McGarry continues to be up and down because, he's been playing on one leg basically since week 5, week 6, or whenever that was. Jake Matthews continues to be Jake Matthews, mostly holding up in this game. Nick Bonito got him a couple of times late in the game in the fourth quarter because, Nick Bonito has, great speed and he also times the snap really well in those two particular reps and whatnot. So it's not to sit here and blame this loss on the Falcons offensive line. As I said yesterday on the podcast, the last couple of days on the podcast, this was a team loss, right? Basically everybody on the team stunk on Sunday, right? And it's not to sit here and be like, oh, the Falcons offensive line is bad, right? I think this offensive line is more than good enough that this team can get to the playoffs. But my concern is that if and when you get to the playoffs, the probability that you face a front as good as Denver's increases dramatically. And when this offensive line gets in those types of matchups, this offensive line continually leaves me wanting. We saw that earlier this season against the Pittsburgh Steelers and whatnot. But, it really just boils down to my hope when it comes to this offensive line, that when we get to Michael Penix, right, in a few years, right, not in a few weeks, but in a few years, when we get to Michael Penix, that he's going to be able to play behind an offensive line that we're not having that conversation where it's like, oh, well, they're good enough, right? And to me, I feel like you got to start sowing those seeds if you're going to have that in the future for Michael Penix in a post Kirk Cousins era, today, because you'll reap it tomorrow. And as you see with a player like Bergeron, who, hasn't really hit his stride yet, and he's in year 2. You saw it with Caleb McGarry as well, that it took the better part of 3 or 4 years before he really hit his stride. Chris Lindstrom basically being good right off the jump is not the norm when it comes to offensive line. It takes the better part of 3 or 4 years for these guys to develop. And so you need to start planting those seeds now if you're going to do that. And so I know in a couple of months, I'm going to be down in Mobile at the Senior Bowl looking at these offensive line, D-line, one-on-ones and whatnot, and not only checking out the pass rushers, but licking my lips, looking at some of these offensive linemen, thinking like, man, some of these guys would be great pickups for the Falcons. Some of these guys are exactly what I want for this Falcons offensive line moving forward. That would be great, protecting Michael Penix's blind side or the interior and all that stuff. And I know because the Falcons have a finite number of resources with very limited draft picks, with very limited cap space, that they don't really have the assets to really invest as much in the offensive line and other areas as they need to invest in the defense, which we'll talk about later in today's episode, because the defense definitely needs major investments there. But, I'm just going to have to make peace with this idea that, they're not going to be able to make the upgrades that I want them to. And I'm just going to have to hope that, Bergeron next year in year 3, hopefully will get better play down the stretch this year, but that big leap that he can make in year 3 and be actually good and not just functional at best at this point in time, and like that'll make it work, and we'll run it back more than likely with the same 5. We'll see what Dahlman does down the stretch as well, since he's a free agent this year. But the expectation I have is we'll run it back with the same 5, and hopefully that will lead to positive gains. It's led to better play this year from the offensive line, absolutely, than what we saw last year. But it still needs to be better, if you ask me. So, talking about the Michael Penix future, let's talk a little bit about the Penix present. We'll do a full breakdown for the Locked On Falcons Insiders on the extended All-22 review, looking at all 5 of his pass plays. And my quick summary for that is that I thought the first 2 plays were really impressive. I thought the other 3 plays left a little bit to be desired, and we'll break that down on the extended All-22 review. And so if you're interested in checking that out and seeing the full crisp HD video of the All-22 of Michael Penix, as well as other topics on today's episode, make sure you become an insider by clicking that link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/lockedonfalcons. You get a 14-day free trial. So you can check out my Penix breakdown for free and get, 2 more weeks of free content. And you can go back and peruse all the great extended All-22 reviews we've done this year. You can go back and look at my draft breakdowns, all that stuff and more. We might even start getting into Senior Bowl prep in the coming weeks as I get ready for Mobile. So 14-day free trial, looking at some prospects there. And then it's $4.99 a month after that. So well worth your while. So check that out in the link in the description below. But we will continue today's episode talking about the defense, getting into what is my biggest beef with the Jimmy Lake scheme and sort of how the Falcons can deal with that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Guys, I want to tell you about Prize Picks, America's #1 daily fantasy sports app with over 10 million active users. And the reason why they have so many users and members is because it's the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Because unlike on other apps, on Prize Picks, it's just you against the numbers. Pick more or less on at least 2 player stat projections and watch the winnings roll in. And now you can win up to 100 times your money with as little as 4 correct picks. And if you're looking to get in on the action because certain sports books aren't available in your state, like Georgia, don't worry, Prize Picks is, and withdrawals are fast, safe, and secure, and I can get my money in as quick as 15 minutes. So check it out by downloading the Prize Picks app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL and get $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONNFL for $50 instantly when you play $5. Prize Picks, run your game. Pre-alcohol probiotic drink by Zbiotics is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. Pre-alcohol produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. Just remember to make Zbiotics your first drink of the night. Drink responsibly, and you'll feel your best tomorrow. So I first gave pre-alcohol a try when I was hanging out with some old college buddies, and you wouldn't believe how on top of my game I was the very next day. And I'm definitely today drinking a lot more responsibly than I used to drink when I hung out with my college buddies. But if you're trying to enjoy your tomorrows, make sure you go to zbiotics.com/LockedOnNFL and learn more and get 15% off your first order when you use Locked On NFL at checkout. Zbiotics is backed with a 100% money back guarantee. So if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money. No questions asked. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/LockedOnNFL and use code LockedOnNFL at checkout for 15% off. So before we get into my #1 beef with Jimmy Lake's defensive scheme, I do want to say sort of my biggest takeaway from watching the film was I think the Falcons defense struggled more than they usually did because of the replacements, like role players and backups like Clark Phillips and Richie Grant and Lorenzo Carter getting, extended action for the first time in weeks with Carter coming off of IR and Grant and whatnot and Phillips and whatnot. I feel like the Falcons had some miscommunication issues that led to some big plays, including a couple of touchdowns in this game. And we'll explore more of that in the extended All-22 review. But let's talk about, the schematic issues. And my #1 beef with the Jimmy Lake scheme is the off coverage. I would much rather prefer this team play more press coverage. I don't feel like this team should be fully a press team like they were last year under Ryan Nielsen. I just don't think they have the cornerback personnel to really run that. But I think they need to be more selective with their press. For example, like in the red zone, especially when you have AJ Terrell lining 6 yards off the ball on a 2nd and goal from the 7 and whatnot. But those sort of specific selective instances where it's just like, can we play press in those situations? When it's 3rd and 2, can we play press in those situations? And so those are the things that frustrate me watching the film week in and week out, where it's just like certain situations where the Falcons we're just going to concede yards. And it's like, why are we so willing to concede 6 yards on a 3rd and 2? Right. We should not want to concede any yards on those particular instances. And that is something that comes up constantly watching the film. But, playing, my preference for press coverage versus off coverage, it's not because I think there's something inherently flawed with off coverage. There's plenty of teams that don't really play press coverage that are constantly off. The Chargers are a good example of a good defense that rarely plays press coverage, right? There are other teams that are like the Falcons, that the Falcons will typically press one corner, in our case, AJ Terrell, and you have the other guy consistently playing off. There are other teams that do that, other good defenses. Pittsburgh's one of them. Joey Porter Jr. will play press and Dante Jackson will play off. Right, the Rams did that last year under Raheem Morris. Right, Akello Witherspoon was their press guy, and whoever the other corner, Darian Kendrick, whoever it was, would play off. Right, and so you can play that style, but you probably could note like, what's different about the Falcons offense versus the Rams and the Steelers and the Chargers? Well, those other teams get much more reliable pressure than the Atlanta Falcons do. So it is harder. They're not necessarily conceding those because guys can get to the quarterback in the time it takes for them to throw it off, right? So that when you have this one corner, in our case, Mike Hughes or Clark Phillips playing 8 to 10 yards off the ball, we're conceding those easy completions, but those other teams are able to disrupt that by getting more reliable pressure, where you have butt kickers, so to speak, if we want to use that broad term, in LA with Jared Verse and Kobe Young Byron Young and Kobe Turner now this year playing the same style of defense. The Chargers have Joey Bosa and Khalil Mack and Tuli Puluotau, and Pittsburgh, of course, has TJ Watt and Alex Highsmith and Cam Hayward and all those other guys. And so Falcons don't really have any of those guys, right? Our closest guy to that caliber of player at this point is Arnold Ebiketie. And I think Arnold Ebiketie has played well basically since the Carolina game. It was sort of his breakout performance. And I think we talked about that on one of the extended R22 reviews, where it's like, this was arguably Arnold Ebiketie's best game of his career, right? And since then, he's been consistently a reliable producer for this Falcons pass rush. And I think that's a contributing factor going back to what we talked about on yesterday's episode, where you look at basically from like weeks 5 through 10, the Falcons defense generally played, I'm not going to say well, but played well enough to win games. And having a player like Arnold Ebiketie being able to produce the pressure that he was producing during that period of time, I think was a major contributing factor to why you saw a slight uptick in the Falcons' performance on defense. But during that stretch of games, he was basically performing at the level that we wanted to see from him, or at least I wanted to see from him this year, because I didn't have expectations that he was going to be this 10 sack guy that I think a lot of other people had going into the season. But I was like, be a guy that can get us 40, 45, maybe even 50 pressures. And if that works out to be a 6 to 8 sack guy, that's typically what that type of pass rusher and production produces. Obviously, we're not getting the sacks and whatnot. I think some of that is owed to the off coverage, and the Falcons are not converting sacks. They're not converting pressure into sacks at the same rate that they have done in the past, which again, I think is owed somewhat to that off coverage as well as other variables and whatnot. But once you get past Arnold Ebiketie, your next best pass rusher is basically Grady Jarrett. And, we love Grady on this podcast. We will always love Grady on this podcast, but he's not that dude anymore, right? At this point in his career, this version of Grady Jarrett would probably be the number 4 guy on a good pass rush, not the number 2 guy where he currently is for the Atlanta Falcons. And you also have Caden Ellis, who's been basically the number 3 guy for this Falcons pass rush, and really kind of been the number 2 guy these last couple of weeks, with Grady kind of taking a downturn. And you saw against Denver, like he didn't really get that many opportunities to rush quarterback. I counted 5 times. He was effective. I think I counted 2 pressures when he did rush the quarterback on those 5 plays. But the Falcons couldn't really lean on him rushing the quarterback to the degree that they wanted to, probably in likelihood, because we talked about this in the lead up to the game, because they were concerned about Bo Nix's mobility. Now, of course, Bo Nix didn't really have to use his legs because he could just pick apart the Falcons defense with his arm. But part of the reason why the Falcons couldn't maybe be as aggressive blitzing Caden Ellis this week as they have done in previous games is because they knew that they didn't have another linebacker spying the quarterback, a capable linebacker spying the quarterback behind him with Nate Landman, right? So they needed to have Caden Ellis be that sort of plan B or plan A or whatever when it came to spying the quarterback. And I'm not trying to sit here and blame it all on Nate Landman, like Nate Landman's the reason why the Falcons defense is bad. But to me, I don't think it's a coincidence that last year's defense was a top 5 third down defense that went out of its way to hide Nate Landman on third downs, right? And this year's defense doesn't really try to hide Nate Landman on obvious passing situations. And is it a coincidence that it's now a bottom 5 defense? That Nate Landman is an every down player. And again, not blaming it on Nate Landman, but, I could sit here and criticize his coaching staff and say, how dare you, play Nate Landman? And you should do what Ryan Nielsen did and hide him. But at the same time, like, to me, that's less of the coaching staff is bad for playing Nate Landman. And it's just like, I don't think the Falcons really have the personnel for an alternative option, right? That the Falcons in those games hiding Nate Landman, in 10 out of the 15 games that Nate Landman started last year, they would play dime on the vast majority of third downs. That's what I mean by hiding him. They would pull him off the field because they would play a traditional dime front, which is a 4-1 with 1 linebacker, versus a Ruby dime front which is a 3-2 with 2 linebackers. And so they would play with 1 linebacker, that being Caden Ellis. He would often rush in those situations, right? And so they would pull Landman off the field in favor of that third safety, which at the beginning of the year was DeMarco Hellams. In the back half of the season, when Hellams was the starter, it was Richie Grant, right? And because of injuries to Troy Anderson, JD Bertrand, DeMarco Hellams, right? They don't really have an alternative option to really play that dime defense. Kevin King has been their primary dime back. He started Sunday as the nickel corner due to all the injuries at the position, and then injured himself, got concussed on the opening series of the game. I don't particularly think Kevin King has played well enough, to think that expanding his role beyond the 2 to 3 snaps that he typically plays in a dime each week to being the 10 or 15 snap guy that the typical dime defender played last year under Ryan Nielsen is a good idea. Richie Grant is also a player that, despite his experience, clearly the coaching staff doesn't trust him. They don't have a lot of faith in him. That's evidenced by him basically coming in to replace Kevin King in the first half, and then his poor performance in the first half led to him being benched and replaced by Natron Books in the second half of the season. And, unfortunately for Richie, I thought against the Eagles, he was fine in limited opportunities. Since then, not particularly great. So to me, this is less of a Jimmy Lake is a bad coach because he's overusing Nate Landman issue, but more just, I think the Falcons just do not have good enough personnel at linebacker, cornerback, and safety at this point, given all the injuries that have mounted this year, to really mitigate the presence of Nate Landman, who I think is, again, not blaming the Falcons defensive issues on him, but his presence to me is, somewhat of a liability at this point in time. And so to me, the Falcons, until they get healthy, right, and hopefully between now and the end of the season, we'll get Troy back healthy. We'll get JD Bertrand back healthy. We'll get DeMarco Hellams back healthy, which Raheem Morris indicated earlier this week is a possibility at some point this season. When that possibility comes, we'll see. But if they can get those guys back healthy, they can continue to tread water and have alternative options out there. But to me, the real issue is going to be, you're going to have to wait till the offseason to really solve those issues. And that's where we're going to finish up today's episode, talking about some of these problem areas and how this team can address their problem areas in the offseason, including on their defensive front, to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Time is a precious commodity, and sometimes I find myself disappointed with how much I feel like I'm wasting scrolling mindlessly on my phone. And I often think, man, I could probably be spending my time more wisely looking for ways to improve myself. And thankfully, our sponsor, Hillsdale College, has an offer of more than 40 free, that's right, free online courses that will help me improve my mind, my body, and my soul when it comes to topics like history, politics, economics, philosophy, chemistry, and mathematics. All their courses are self-paced, so you can start whenever you want. And plus, you can go deeper with the readings, the quizzes, the discussions, or you can just sit back and enjoy the lectures. So head on right now to hillsdale.edu/lockedon to enroll. There's no cost. It's easy to get started. That's hillsdale.edu/lockedon to register. hillsdale.edu/lockedon. So we know that, when we get to the offseason, all the oxygen in the room is going to be taken up on how do the Falcons upgrade their pass rush. It is absolutely their biggest priority, and, without going too deep onto it on today's episode, trust me, we will talk quite a bit about this over the next, 9 months, 6 to 9 months. So we don't necessarily have to get all the takes off on today's episode, but, as I see it, as things sit here today, I feel like, you're looking to have a 10-man rotation up front, right? 4 edge rushers, 6 D linemen, right? And I think 2 out of your 4 edge rushers next year will be Arnold Ebiketie and Braylon Trice, right? And then 4 out of your 6 D linemen next year will be Zach Harrison, Ruka Roro, Brandon Dorless, and Grady Jarrett, right? And so based off of that math, you got, 6 out of the 10 guys that you need. And so 3 out of the 4 that you need to add need to be starting caliber players. That includes, edges, 2 edges, and a nose tackle, right? And at this current junction, we'll see if this changes in the next month or two. But I'm not expecting David Onyemata, Eddie Goldman, Matthew Judon, Lorenzo Carter, or Kentavious Street back on the roster in 2025. Taquan Graham, James Smith-Williams, both free agents. They're toss-ups at this point. I think a lot of whether or not they come back is going to depend on price. If they sign 1-year sort of cheap deals, I think they come back. But those are still spots, regardless of that you could certainly upgrade. But, instead of adding 4 players, you need to add 6 if that's the case. But that will be the focus. But it's not the only area where I think the Falcons get better. As I outlined before, they have some concerns at linebacker, cornerback, and safety. right? Cornerback and safety are two potential starts where you may need new starters, right? Mike Hughes and Justin Simmons are both free agents and similar, their return may depend on price tag and whatnot. Do you look to add a starting linebacker, right? I think Caden Ellis should return at this point in time, but can you trust Troy Anderson to be that other starter? And can you trust Troy Anderson to stay healthy if he is that starter, right? That's a big question at this point in time. And a lot of that, depending on how much trust and faith you have in Troy Anderson moving forward, will probably depend on how he plays over the final 6 games, if he plays over the final 6 games at this point in time. So, we talked about the lack of depth there at corner, linebacker, and safety, and it's not because the Falcons' depth is bad there, but as I explained before, it's kind of limited when you have guys like Landman and Richie Grant and Kevin King, et cetera. And like those are areas that you can upgrade, right? But when it comes to upgrading those other areas beyond just looking at the pass rush, like you have 3 options, right, this offseason, right? The most likely option that the Falcons will take is that they're just going to trust on guys internally, J.D. Bertrand, DeMarco Hellams, current guys on their roster to kind of step up as they gain experience and develop to fill some of those and improve that depth, right? Or B, your option is you could draft guys in the middle rounds, right? These positions we're talking about, like non-priority positions like corner, linebacker, safety, are positions that are ripe to use 3rd, 4th, and 5th round picks for. But guess what? The Falcons lack 3rd, a 5th, and a 6th, right? They only have a 4th, right? So unless you're going to pull off a bunch of trades this offseason, you're probably not going to have the ammunition to address it in the draft. Now, option C is probably what I would do if I was in the room with Terry Fontenot, but I would probably address some of these areas by signing cheap veteran free agents with very little guaranteed money and have those guys come in and compete with the Bertrands and the Hellams. And if the young guys win the competition, then you can, move on from those guys with little fuss. If they don't, then you have proven options and still have those guys waiting in the wings to see what they develop into a year from now or 2 years from now. But this is why, like, I think a lot of the Falcons' issues are more, not to say the scheme it's not fair to criticize the scheme, but like I look at it and I'm like, you just got to get better personnel, right? It's basically like firing Jimmy Lake is not going to make Nate Landman run a 4.6. Firing Jimmy Lake is not going to let Clark Phillips grow 3 inches. It's not going to make Richie Grant into a more consistent and reliable safety, all those various things. So it's kind of similar to what we talked about last year when people were very critical of Arthur Smith's play calling, when it's like, and people wanted to blame all the Falcons issues on that. And it's like, yes, it's very frustrating to watch, a handful of questionable play calls every single week, but don't let those handful of play calls force you to ignore the vast majority of the play calls that, again, I'm not going to say are good, but are certainly not the problem, not holding you back in a major way. So when it comes to Jimmy Lake, yes, I too want to pull my hair out in the 3rd quarter when the Broncos are at the 7-yard line and they have AJ Terrell line 6 yards off the ball. And you're sitting there like, man, can we get him in press coverage 2 to 3 yards off the ball, and watch 5 different Falcon defenders get blocked on that particular play to give Troy Franklin a runway on the Denver's 2nd screen touchdown of the game. Yeah, it's incredibly frustrating, guys. But I'm not going to sit there and act like that's, I'm not going to make a mountain out of a molehill. All right. As I've explained before, right, in an NFL game, typically you have 65 plays for the offense or defense. And a few bad plays are not the end of the world, right? And the way I've likened it is if you took a 65 question quiz and you missed 5 of those questions, you still get an A on that quiz. And so that's the perspective that I try to use to try to keep me grounded when it comes to being critical of the play calling. It's fair to be critical of the play calling, but I'm not going to sit here and be like, man, a handful of bad play calls is like, you got to fire the guy when they're basically getting an A or a B plus, if you look at it from that perspective. But, my hope is that this offseason we'll see the Falcons try to address some of these issues that will make the Jimmy Lake scheme, or really the Raheem Moore scheme that Jimmy Lake is out here calling, more palatable. At this point, as I've explained, I'm expecting the bare minimum when it comes to addressing some of the concerns on the back 7 on the defense at linebacker, corner, and safety. I'm expecting the bare minimum when it comes to addressing some of my concerns on the offensive line. And so I'm hoping that the Falcons will at least make me happy by, if they're going to ignore some of these other problem areas for the team, that they will overinvest, right? By underinvesting in those areas, they will overinvest in improving the defensive front. And that will at least allow me to be able to palate, what we will see at those other spots, those other problem areas moving forward. So hopefully I will not be sitting here in the end of the first week of free agency in March, ticked off like I was last year, complaining about complacency and all that stuff. Hopefully we're not going to be sitting here having continuing conversations about opportunity costs on this podcast after this season, because the Falcons will not blow those opportunities as they did arguably this past offseason with certain decisions and choices made that, ignored the pass rush. But that is going to do it for us here on today's All-22 review. If you want to check out the extended All-22 review, check out the link in the description below. Again, in addition to talking about Michael Penix, some of the offensive line issues, we'll talk about some of the miscommunication breakdowns on the defense and some of these things that maybe want to pull my hair out for Jimmy Lake. So you can revisit, and be just as frustrated as me watching the film of that. So hit that link in the description at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons, 14-day free trial, then $4.99 a month. After that point, our next episode will be not a crossover Thursday. It will be a crossover Thursday, but we won't be, because the Falcons are on a bye. But instead, I think we'll be having Alan Stirk of the Falcoholic to be our guest as that crossover guest. So look forward to that. Continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. Check out Locked On NFL for your second listen. 2 shows daily. Tyler Rowland, Tony Wiggins, giving you that shot of NFL espresso and that real talk from the barbershop each and every day on Locked On NFL. Find it on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.